Jack, I need you to answer me properly tonight. Where do you keep going every night?
Susan, we have talked about this before. It is work.
Work? Jack, what kind of work keeps calling a married man out of his house at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, sometimes even 3 in the morning?
My work is not an office job. Chief can call me at any time. If something happens and he needs security, I have to be there.
That is always your answer. Chief called. Something happened. You traveled suddenly. There is always something, Jack.
Because that is the truth.
Then why do I feel like I know nothing about my own husband? Sometimes you leave this house and I don't see you until the next morning. Other times, you disappear for days.
Susan, I have never hidden from you that my work can take me away.
There is a difference between traveling for work and disappearing without telling your wife where you are going.
I understand that you worry.
Susan was 33 years old and lived in Ibadan with her mother, whom everyone simply called Mama, and her older brother, Chidi. Their father had died some years earlier, and since his death, the small family had become even closer. Their house was not a rich person's house, but it was comfortable enough for them. Mama had done her best to raise her children well, and now that Susan and Chidi were adults, both of them worked and helped with the bills. Susan worked in an office in Ibadan, and although her salary was not very big, she was responsible with her money. She bought what she needed, helped Mama whenever she could, and saved a little every month. Chidi also had a job and carried many of the family responsibilities because he was the eldest. Mama was proud of both of them, but like many mothers, there was one thing that still worried her about Susan. Susan was already in her 30s and had not married. Mama never wanted to make her daughter feel bad about it, but sometimes when they sat together in the evening, she would carefully bring up the matter. "My daughter, I am not saying you should rush," Mama would tell her. "Marriage is not something you enter because people are talking. I only pray that God gives you a good man, somebody who will respect you and give you peace." Susan always smiled whenever Mama spoke like that. "Mama, I know. When the right person comes, I will know. I don't want to marry because my friends are married. I want to marry someone I can live with." Mama would nod and leave the matter there. Susan had watched some of her friends rush into relationships because they were afraid of getting older, and she had also watched some of those relationships end badly. Because of this, she told herself that she would rather wait than marry the wrong person. She had dated before, but none of those relationships had become serious. Some men wanted too much too quickly, some were not honest, while others simply did not make her feel secure. Then she met Jack. Their meeting was not dramatic. It happened one afternoon when Susan had gone out after work to buy a few things. Jack noticed her, approached her politely, and started a conversation. At first, Susan did not take him seriously. She had heard many lines from men before and believed Jack might be another man who would ask for her number, call for a few days, and disappear. But Jack was different. He was calm, he did not pressure her, and when Susan told him she was not interested in wasting her time, he seemed to understand. "I am not asking you to decide anything today," Jack told her. "Just give me the chance to know me. If you don't like what you see, you can walk away." There was something about the way he spoke that made Susan listen. He looked confident, well-dressed, and very sure of himself. He was not the kind of man who talked too much about what he owned. Instead, he asked Susan about her work, her family, and what she wanted in life. Susan eventually gave him her phone number, though she warned herself not to expect too much. Jack called the next day, and then the day after that. He did not disappear. He called in the mornings to ask if she had reached work safely, and sometimes he called at night to ask how her day had gone. When he wanted to see her, he asked respectfully instead of appearing at her house without warning. Over time, Susan became comfortable with him. Their first few outings were simple. They ate together, sat in quiet places, and talked. Jack listened when Susan spoke. He remembered small things she told him, even things she had forgotten herself. One evening, Susan mentioned that she had been struggling with a faulty phone. 2 days later, Jack arrived with a new phone in a sealed box. Susan stared at it in surprise. "Jack, what is this?" she asked. "You said your phone was giving you trouble," he replied as if it was nothing. "So I got you another one." Susan pushed the box back toward him. "This is too much. We have not even been together for long." Jack smiled. "It is just a phone, Susan. I can afford it. I want you to use it." She hesitated before accepting it, and even after she took it, she felt slightly uncomfortable. She was not used to a man spending money on her so freely. But that was only the beginning. Jack bought her shoes, handbags, and clothes. If Susan told him she had a difficult month, money would appear in her account. Sometimes she would wake up and see an alert from him without even asking. He took her to good restaurants, paid for everything, and never complained. More importantly, he did not treat Susan like he was buying her love. He continued to call her, ask about her health, and show interest in her life. When she became sick one weekend, Jack brought medicine, food, and fruit. Mama noticed the change in her daughter. Susan smiled more often, spent longer on the phone at night, and sometimes entered the house carrying things Mama knew she had not bought for herself. One evening, Mama finally asked, "This person that keeps making you smile at your phone, when are we going to meet him?" Susan laughed. "Mama, please, we're still getting to know each other." "I did not say you should marry him tomorrow," Mama replied. "I am only asking." Chidi also teased her. "At least tell us his name before one stranger carries our sister away." Susan threw a cushion at him. "His name is Jack, and nobody is carrying me anywhere." As the months passed, Susan and Jack became serious. Jack told her about his work. According to him, he worked for a very wealthy chief in Ibadan. The chief was a powerful man who had many businesses and moved with a lot of security. Jack said he worked mainly as a bouncer and security man, and because the chief trusted him, he often stayed at the chief's residence or followed him to different places. Susan found the job unusual, but Jack explained it in a simple way. "The man has enemies," he told her one evening. "People with money always have people around them. I am one of the men who handles security and follows him when necessary." Susan looked at him. "So, you are like his bodyguard?" "Something like that," Jack replied. "Sometimes I stand at events, sometimes I go with him on trips, sometimes I help control people around him. It depends on what he needs." "And that is why you are always at his house?" Susan asked. "Yes, most of the time that is where we stay. He likes his trusted men close." Susan accepted the explanation. She did wonder how Jack seemed to have so much money from working as a bouncer, but she assumed the chief paid his trusted workers very well. Jack never seemed short of money. If they went out with some of his friends, he could easily pay a large bill without checking the amount twice. Sometimes he carried thick bundles of cash. When Susan asked, he simply said the chief paid him for extra jobs and travel. Because Jack was generous with her and never asked her for money, Susan did not question him too deeply. Instead, she began to see him as a hard-working man who had found a good position with a wealthy employer. One major thing Jack did for her made Susan believe even more that he was serious about their future. Susan had once complained that she wanted more privacy. She loved Mama and Chidi, but she felt she was getting older and needed a space of her own. She had been saving money to rent a small apartment when Jack told her not to worry about it. Susan thought he meant he would help with part of the rent, but a few weeks later, he took her to see a beautiful 3-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of Ibadan. The compound was neat, the rooms were spacious, and the sitting room was much larger than Susan had expected. She walked from room to room in shock. "Why are we here?" she asked. Jack smiled and held out a set of keys. "Because this is yours." Susan looked at him confused. "Mine? How?" "I rented it for you." She stared at him for several seconds. "Jack, stop joking." "I'm not joking. 3 bedrooms. For me alone? You said you wanted space. Now you have space." Susan could hardly speak. "How much did you pay for this place?" Jack laughed. "Why are you asking questions that will only give you a headache?" Susan became serious. "Jack, this is not a small thing. You did not even tell me." He moved closer to her. "Susan, I want you to be comfortable. You are my woman. I'm not doing this because you asked me. I am doing it because I want to." Susan felt tears in her eyes. Nobody had ever done anything like that for her. Before she could recover from the surprise of the rent, Jack began furnishing the apartment. He bought a sofa, a television, a large bed, wardrobes, a dining table, curtains, kitchen appliances, and many other things. Susan protested several times. "You don't have to buy everything at once," she told him. "We can take our time." Jack always gave the same answer. "I want you to have a good home." When Mama came to see the apartment, even she was surprised. She moved around quietly, touching the furniture and looking at the clean rooms. "This man really spent money here," she said when Jack was not around. Susan smiled. "I told you he takes care of me." Mama looked at her daughter carefully. Taking care of you is good, but make sure you are also looking at his character. Money is good, but peace is better. Susan nodded. Mama, he's a good man. He has never treated me badly. Mama did not argue. She only said, I pray it remains that way. Jack's relationship with Susan grew stronger, and after they had dated for some time, he proposed. He did not make it too complicated. He took Susan out to dinner, and toward the end of the evening, he told her he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. When he brought out the ring, Susan immediately covered her mouth in shock. She had expected the relationship to lead to marriage, but she had not known the proposal would come so soon. Jack looked at her and said, Susan, I have watched you. I know the kind of woman you are. I don't want to keep dating you forever. I want you to be my wife. Susan's eyes filled with tears. Nobody had ever done anything like that for her. She thought about Mama's prayers and how many times she had wondered if she would ever find the right person. She looked at Jack, the man who had been kind to her, generous to her, and patient with her. And she said yes. Susan returned home that night, glowing with happiness. Mama noticed the ring almost immediately. What is that on your hand? She asked. Susan began laughing before Mama even finished the question. Chidi came into the sitting room and looked from Susan's face to her hand. Ah, so it has happened. Susan lifted her hand proudly. Jack proposed. Mama hugged her daughter, and for a while the house was filled with joy. Chidi congratulated her too, but unlike Mama, his happiness seemed slightly controlled. He had not yet met Jack properly, and he wanted to see the man who planned to marry his sister. A few days later, Susan told Jack it was time to formally visit her family. Jack agreed without hesitation. He dressed well and arrived at the family house with drinks, food items, and gifts. Mama liked his confidence and respect. Jack greeted her properly, thanked her for receiving him, and explained that he loved Susan and wanted to marry her. Mama asked him questions about his work, his family, and his plans for marriage. Jack answered calmly. I work with a chief here in Ibadan, he explained. I handle security for him, and I also follow him for some of his business movements. I have been with him for some years. Mama asked, and you can take care of a family? Jack smiled. Yes, Mama. I would not come here if I was not ready. Susan sat beside him, looking happy. Chidi had been quiet for most of the visit. The first moment he saw Jack clearly, something changed in his face. At first, he was not sure why the man looked familiar. He watched Jack as he spoke, trying to remember where he had seen him. Then, slowly, an old memory returned. Chidi had gone to university many years earlier, and although Jack had not been his close friend, he remembered seeing him around campus. Jack had moved with a group of young men many students were afraid of. There were stories about fights, cult activities, threats, and violent jobs done for people outside the university. Chidi had never personally seen Jack commit a serious crime, but he remembered the type of people Jack moved with and the fear attached to their names. He did not say anything while Jack was still in the house. He waited until the visit ended and Jack drove away. Susan was still smiling when Chidi called her into his room. Susan, sit down. She looked at him strangely. Why are you looking serious? I want to ask you something about Jack. Susan sat on the edge of the bed. What? Chidi folded his arms. How long have you known him? For some time now. Why? What exactly did he tell you he does? Susan frowned. He works for a chief, he is a bouncer and security man. You heard him say it. Chidi shook his head slowly. Susan, I think I know this man. Her smile disappeared. Know him from where? From university. Susan looked surprised. You and Jack went to the same university? Yes, we were not friends, but I know his face. I have been trying to remember since he entered this house. I am almost sure he is the same person. Susan waited. Chidi lowered his voice. That man used to move with some very dangerous boys. Susan immediately became defensive. Dangerous how? The kind of boys people avoided, the kind that were always linked to trouble, fights, threats, cult groups, all those things. Susan shook her head. Chidi, that was university. People do foolish things when they are young. Susan, Listen to me first. I am listening. There were also stories that some rich men used those boys for dirty work. They were paid to scare people, attack people, and handle problems that normal people did not want their names connected to. Susan stared at her brother. Stories, Chidi. You just said stories. Yes, stories, but I remember what those boys were like. Jack was not somebody people played with. Susan became annoyed. So, because you saw him around with some bad boys years ago, I should end my relationship. He did not say that yet. I am telling you to be careful. Jack is not like that now. How do you know? Because I know him. Chidi stared at her. How well? Susan stood up. Very well. He treats me well. He respects me. He has never raised his hand at me. He has never insulted me. He takes care of me. He has been nothing but good to me. Chidi sighed. A man can be good to you and still be doing bad things outside. Susan shook her head. I knew you would find something wrong. You always think nobody is good enough. This is not about being good enough. This is about your safety. Chidi's voice became more serious. Susan, please think. This man says he is a bouncer, but look at the money he spends. He rented 3 bedrooms for you. He furnished everything. He drives around with money. Does that not make you ask questions? Susan paused, but only for a moment. His boss is very rich. Maybe he pays him well. Maybe, but please don't marry him with your eyes closed. Susan left the room upset. For the first time since Jack proposed, a little doubt entered her mind. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She remembered some things Jack had told her about his university days. He had never given much detail. Whenever she asked about old friends, he usually changed the subject. But Susan did not want to judge a man because of his past. She had seen people change. She told herself Chidi was only being protective because he was her older brother. The following morning, Chidi spoke to Mama. Mama listened carefully and became concerned. Later that evening, she called Susan. Your brother told me something about Jack. Susan sighed immediately. Mama, please, I already know what he told you. Then sit down and talk to me. Susan sat beside her mother. Mama held her hand. I am not saying Jack is a bad person. I don't know him well enough to say that. But if your brother remembers something serious about his past, should you not at least ask questions? Mama, everybody has a past. Yes, but some pasts are more dangerous than others. Susan's eyes became wet with frustration. What do you want me to do? Throw away my relationship because somebody said he moved with bad boys when he was young? Jack has been good to me. He has never shown me that he is dangerous. Mama spoke gently. My daughter, love can make us explain things we would question if they happened to somebody else. Susan looked away. He has changed. Did he tell you he was like that before? Mama asked. Susan became quiet. Not exactly. Then how do you know he changed? Susan had no clear answer. Still, she refused to give up the relationship. I love him, Mama. I want to marry him. I believe the man I know now. Mama could see that Susan had already made her decision. She sighed and squeezed her daughter's hand. Then I will not force you. But please, watch carefully. Do not close your eyes because you love someone. Chidi was more direct. When Susan told him she was still going ahead with the wedding, he became angry. Then remember this conversation, he told her. I am your brother. I am warning you because I love you. If this marriage brings trouble, don't say nobody told you. Susan felt hurt. So if something happens, you will abandon me? That is not what I said. You just said you won't help me. Chidi shook his head. I am saying don't walk into danger and expect everybody to pretend we did not warn you. Their argument ended badly, and for several days they barely spoke. Jack noticed Susan was quieter than usual and asked what was wrong. Susan eventually told him that Chidi believed he knew him from university. For a brief moment, Jack's face became unreadable. Then he laughed. Your brother remembers university days. He said you moved with rough people. Jack leaned back. I did. I was young. I had friends I should not have had. Many people did foolish things at that age. Susan studied him. Were you in trouble? Nothing that concerns my life now. Chidi thinks some rich people used you and your friends for bad jobs. Jack's expression hardened slightly, but he quickly relaxed. Susan, people talk. If your brother heard a story 15 years ago, what do you want me to do about it today? Susan looked at him for a long moment. I just want to know I am not making a mistake. Jack reached for her hand. Look at how I treat you. Judge me by the man in front of you, not by campus gossip. That was exactly what Susan wanted to hear. She held on to those words and moved forward with the wedding plans. Jack spent heavily on the marriage. Their traditional wedding was large with many guests, plenty of food, music, and beautiful decorations. Some of Jack's friends attended, including men Susan had never seen before. They dressed well, drove expensive cars, and seemed very close to Jack. Chidi watched them carefully, but said nothing because he did not want to ruin his sister's day. Mama also decided to support Susan and pray for the best. After the traditional ceremony, Susan and Jack completed their court wedding and became legally married. Susan felt proud and happy. She believed she had finally entered the life she had waited for. After the wedding, Jack moved fully into the 3-bedroom apartment he had rented for Susan. Before then, he had spent most of his time at the chief's residence, but now he said he wanted to live with his wife properly. The first months of the marriage were peaceful. Jack was affectionate, generous, and attentive whenever he was home. He paid the bills, stocked the kitchen, gave Susan money, and encouraged her to continue working because he knew she enjoyed having her own job. On weekends, sometimes they stayed home together, watching television and eating, and on other days they went out. Susan often looked around the apartment and felt grateful. She thought about Chidi's warning sometimes, but then she would look at Jack sitting beside her and wonder how the man her brother had described could be the same man who treated her so gently. Slowly, however, she began noticing things she could not explain. Jack's phone rang at strange hours. At first, Susan did not pay attention because she knew his job involved security. But then she realized that some calls could make him leave the house immediately. One night, they were already in bed when Jack's phone rang around 2 a.m. Susan opened her eyes as he sat up and answered. He listened for a few seconds, then got out of bed and began dressing. Susan looked at the clock. Where are you going? Chief needs me. Now? At 2 a.m? Jack pulled on his trousers. Susan sat upright. What kind of thing comes up every time in the middle of the night? Jack looked at her. Susan, you knew my work was not normal office work. But you just came home. I know, I'll be back. He kissed her forehead and left. Susan remained awake for almost an hour, listening to every sound outside. Jack returned the following morning and acted as though nothing had happened. Another time, he left after a late-night call and did not return for 4 days. Susan called several times, but sometimes his phone was off. When he finally returned, he said he had traveled unexpectedly with the chief. You couldn't call me? Susan asked angrily. I was worried. I'm sorry, Jack said. Everything happened quickly. Do you know what it feels like not knowing where your husband is? I said I'm sorry. He gave her money and later took her out to dinner. And although Susan was still angry, she eventually forgave him. But the pattern continued. Sometimes Jack would disappear for 1 week. Once, he was gone for almost 3 weeks. He always came back with explanations out traveling with the chief, handling security, or following the chief on business. Susan tried to understand, but Chidi's warning kept returning to her mind. More things began making her uncomfortable. Some of Jack's friends from the chief's circle started visiting the apartment. They were not rude to Susan, but something about them made her uneasy. They would sit with Jack in the living room and sometimes lower their voices when she entered. At other times, they spoke in codes or used words Susan did not understand. If she brought drinks and tried to sit down, the conversation would suddenly change. One evening after the men left, Susan confronted Jack. I don't like those people coming here. Jack looked surprised. Why? I don't know. I just don't feel comfortable around them. They are my friends. Then meet them somewhere else. Jack frowned. Susan, this is my house too. I know, but it is also my home. Every time they come here, I feel like I have to leave my own sitting room because you people suddenly start whispering. Jack laughed lightly. You think too much. I am serious. He eventually agreed to reduce their visits, but he did not stop them completely. The biggest shock came one afternoon when Susan was arranging clothes and opened a drawer looking for something. Under some folded items, she saw a gun. She froze immediately. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. She did not touch it. Her heart began beating faster. When Jack came home later, she waited until he had eaten before asking him. "There's a gun in the bedroom." Jack looked at her calmly. "Yes." Susan stared at him. "Yes? That is all you have to say? What do you want me to say? Why do you have a gun in this house?" "For work. You never told me." Jack sighed. "Susan, I work security. Chief has enemies. Sometimes I need protection." "Is it licensed?" she asked quickly. "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Of course I am sure." Susan rubbed her forehead. "I don't like guns, Jack. I don't want that thing in the house. It is not going to hurt you. That is not the point. It stays locked away. You would not even have seen it if you were not opening everything." Susan looked at him sharply. "This is my room too. I should know if there is a gun where I sleep." Jack walked over and put his hands on her shoulders. "Susan, calm down. It is for protection. Nothing more." She wanted to believe him. She truly did. Later that night, however, she lay beside him, unable to sleep. She remembered Chidi telling her that a man could treat her well and still be doing bad things outside. She remembered Mama asking whether she really knew Jack had changed. She thought about the unexplained money, the strange calls, the long trips, the men who whispered when she entered, and now the gun hidden among their things. For the first time, fear settled deeply inside her. She turned and looked at Jack sleeping peacefully beside her. His face looked calm. This was the same man who had rented a home for her, married her proudly, paid their bills, and treated her with affection. He had never hit her. He had never insulted her. He had never denied her anything she needed. Whenever he returned from his trips, he brought gifts and behaved like a loving husband. Susan told herself there had to be an explanation for everything. Maybe Chidi's old memories were making her suspicious of things that were normal because of Jack's work. Maybe being close to a powerful chief truly required strange hours, security men, and guns. Maybe Jack had once lived a rough life but had truly changed. She did not want to destroy her marriage because of fear and suspicion. So once again, Susan pushed the questions to the back of her mind. She continued going to work, continued caring for her home, and continued loving Jack, even though a quiet voice inside her had started asking questions she was no longer completely able to ignore. Each time that voice became loud, Jack's kindness, his generosity, and the life they had built together came to her mind, and she forced herself to believe that the man she married was exactly who he said he was. Time continued to pass, and Susan tried her best to settle fully into married life, even though the strange parts of Jack's lifestyle never completely disappeared. She had learned that asking too many questions often led to the same answers. So after a while, she stopped pressing him every time he returned late or disappeared suddenly. Whenever Jack received a call and left the house at an unusual hour, Susan would watch him get dressed, pick up his phone and keys and walk out of the door with that same calm look on his face. Sometimes she wanted to stand in front of the door and demand a proper explanation, but she would remember how those conversations usually ended. Jack would tell her that Chief needed him, that there was an emergency, that there was a business movement, or that security work did not follow normal office hours. He would then kiss her, promise to return soon, and leave. At times, he came back the following morning. At other times, he disappeared for several days. Once he was away for more than 2 weeks, and Susan spent many nights lying awake and wondering where exactly her husband was sleeping and what kind of work could keep a man away from his home for so long without warning. When Jack finally returned, he came with expensive gifts and enough money to settle every bill in the house, and he behaved as though his absence had been completely normal. Susan would become angry, but the anger rarely lasted. Jack knew how to calm her. He would hold her, apologize for worrying her, and remind her that everything he was doing was for their future. Susan wanted peace in her marriage, so she kept trying to understand. Deep inside her, however, the questions remained. There were still moments when she remembered Chidi's warning and felt a cold fear in her stomach. But she would push the thought away and remind herself that Jack had never harmed her. He was still loving, he still made sure she had everything she needed, he encouraged her to continue working and never try to control her salary. He bought food for the house, paid bills without complaining, and sometimes surprised her with gifts simply because he wanted to see her smile. To Susan, those things mattered. She told herself that perhaps every marriage had something difficult to understand, and that Jack's strange work was simply the burden she had to accept. Then, after some years of marriage, something happened that made Susan temporarily forget many of her fears. She discovered that she was pregnant. At first, she did not believe it. Her monthly period had been late, but because she had been stressed at work, she thought that might be the reason. After a few more days, she bought a pregnancy test on her way home. She entered the bathroom alone and followed the instructions carefully. When she saw the result, she stood still for several seconds staring at it. Her hands began to shake. "No," she whispered, almost laughing. She checked again as though the result might change if she looked twice. It did not. Susan was pregnant. Tears filled her eyes immediately. She had wanted a child for a long time, but she had tried not to put too much pressure on herself. Now, without warning, the thing she had quietly prayed for had finally happened. She sat on the closed toilet seat and placed one hand over her stomach, even though there was nothing to feel yet. A smile spread across her face. For that moment, every worry about Jack disappeared. She thought only about the baby growing inside her. She thought about Mama becoming a grandmother and Chidi becoming an uncle. Most of all, she thought about how Jack would react. Jack was away that evening and did not return until the following night. Susan could hardly wait to tell him. When she heard his car enter the compound, she rushed toward the sitting room but forced herself to slow down because she wanted to see his face properly when she told him. Jack walked in carrying a small travel bag. "You look happy," he said immediately. Susan smiled. "Maybe I am." Jack dropped the bag. "What happened?" "Sit down first." He looked suspiciously but sat. Susan stood in front of him for a moment, trying to control her excitement. "Jack, I went to the pharmacy yesterday." His expression changed. "Are you sick?" "No," she smiled wider. "I'm pregnant." Jack stared at her as though he had not heard properly. "What?" "I said I'm pregnant." His eyes widened and then he stood so quickly that Susan laughed. "Are you serious?" "Yes." "Susan, are you sure?" "I tested twice." Jack grabbed her gently around the waist and lifted her slightly before remembering she was pregnant and quickly putting her down again. Susan laughed as he held her face with both hands. "I'm going to be a father?" "Yes." Jack hugged her tightly. His happiness seemed so real that Susan felt even more emotional. "Thank you," he whispered. Susan pulled back. "Why are you thanking me? We both did it." Jack laughed. That night, he refused to allow Susan to do anything around the house. When she tried to carry a small bowl to the kitchen, he took it from her. When she bent to pick something from the floor, he stopped her. Susan eventually became irritated. "Jack, I am pregnant. I am not sick." "I know, but you have to be careful. The baby is not going to fall out because I carried a plate." Jack laughed and kissed her forehead. From that day, his excitement about the baby became obvious. He gave Susan more money for food, asked about every hospital appointment, and whenever he was around, he wanted to know whether she had eaten properly. Sometimes he would place his hand on her stomach, even before the pregnancy became visible. Susan teased him for it, but secretly she loved seeing that side of him. When Mama heard the news, she was overjoyed. She hugged Susan and prayed for her. Even Chidi, who still had mixed feelings about Jack, could not hide his happiness. "At least now you have given Mama something else to talk about," he joked. Susan smiled. Pregnancy softened some of the tension that had remained between her and Chidi since the wedding. They began speaking more often again, and Susan felt that perhaps the worst of their disagreement was finally behind them. As the months passed, her stomach grew and Jack continued providing generously. His unexplained movements did not stop, but Susan tried harder not to think about them. She wanted peace during her pregnancy. Sometimes Jack would leave for several days and Susan would become angry because she wanted her husband close, especially as the pregnancy became heavier. Once, during her 7th month, Jack left suddenly after receiving a late-night call. Susan followed him into the bedroom as he changed clothes. "You are going again?" she asked. "I have to." "Jack, I am 7 months pregnant." "I know. What if something happens to me tonight?" Jack paused. Call me. Susan stared at him. Sometimes your phone does not even go through. Jack sighed and came closer. Susan, I am not leaving because I want to. Chief needs us for something. I'll try to return tomorrow. You always say that. Please don't stress yourself. Susan's eyes filled with tears, partly because of anger and partly because she was tired. I don't even understand your life anymore. Jack looked at her for a moment, then touched her stomach gently. Everything will be fine. He kissed her and left. Susan stood by the bedroom door listening to his footsteps until she heard the front door close. She sat on the bed afterward and cried quietly. But the next afternoon, Jack returned as promised with bags of baby clothes and other items. Susan wanted to remain angry, but when she saw the tiny clothes and the excitement on his face, she softened again. This became the pattern of their marriage. Fear, questions, apology, gifts, peace, and then another unexplained absence. When the time finally came, Susan gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was difficult, but the moment the nurse placed the baby close to her, Susan forgot the pain. She stared at his small face and began crying. Jack was overwhelmed when he saw the child. He stood beside Susan's hospital bed looking at the baby as though he could not believe the child belonged to him. He looks like you, Susan said weakly. Jack smiled. No, he looks like you. Look at his nose. That nose is yours. Susan laughed softly. Jack bent and kissed her forehead. For the first few months after the baby was born, Jack seemed to spend more time at home than before. Susan noticed the difference and hoped fatherhood had finally changed something in him. Jack carried the baby around the house, bought more clothes than the child could wear, and sometimes sat for long periods just watching him sleep. Susan would stand at the bedroom door and smile at the sight. She had wanted a peaceful family, and during those moments, she believed she finally had one. Jack bought her a car not long after the baby was born. Susan was shocked when he handed her the keys. For what? She asked. You have a baby now. You can't be moving around the way you used to. Jack, this is too much. No, it isn't. You keep saying that about everything. Jack smiled. Enjoy it. Susan was grateful. The car made it easier to go to work, take the baby to appointments, and visit Mama. Her friends admired her life. Some told her she was lucky to have a husband who provided so well. Susan smiled whenever they said it, but sometimes she wondered what they would think if they knew about the midnight calls and long disappearances. She never told them everything. She did not want people asking questions she could not answer herself. As their son grew, Jack's old routine slowly returned. The child was still very young the first time Jack disappeared for almost 2 weeks after becoming a father. Susan was furious. When he finally returned, she did not greet him warmly. You have a child now. You cannot keep disappearing like this. I was working. For 2 weeks? Yes. Without one proper call? Susan, I told you, sometimes we travel suddenly. Your son was sick 3 nights ago. Jack's face changed. What happened? Fever. He is fine now. Why didn't you tell me? Susan laughed bitterly. I called you. Your phone was off. Jack became quiet. Susan looked at him and felt the old fear rising again. What kind of work are you doing that your wife cannot reach you for days? We have discussed this. No, Jack, you have talked. I have listened. That is not the same thing. Jack became slightly impatient. What do you want me to tell you? The truth. I have told you the truth. Then why does it always feel like there is more? Jack stared at her. For a second, Susan thought he might finally explain everything, but instead he looked away and removed his shoes. I'm tired. Susan realized the conversation was over. She did not continue because the baby had started crying in the next room. Life moved on. Their son grew into an active little boy, and by the time he was almost 2, he followed Susan everywhere around the house. Jack loved him deeply whenever he was home. The child would run toward the door when Jack returned from a trip and shout happily, and Jack would lift him into the air and laugh. Watching them together made Susan's heart warm. It also confused her. She could not connect the loving father she saw at home with the dangerous man Chidi had once described. Whenever doubt entered her mind, she looked at Jack playing with their child and told herself she must be worrying too much. Then came the night that changed everything. Jack had been away for several days and returned that evening. Susan was relieved to see him because their son had developed a fever earlier in the day. It was not extremely high, but the child was weak, uncomfortable, and unusually quiet. Susan had already given him medicine recommended for him and was watching him closely. When Jack entered the house, the boy tried to get up from the sofa but did not have his normal energy. Jack immediately noticed. "What is wrong with him?" he asked. "Fever," Susan replied. "It started this afternoon." Jack placed his hand on the child's forehead. "He's hot. I gave him medicine. If it does not come down, I will take him to the hospital." "Why didn't you call me?" Susan looked at Jack tiredly. "I did. Your phone was unavailable." Jack said nothing. He carried the child and sat down with him. For a while, the three of them remained in the sitting room. Susan brought food for Jack, but he ate only a little because he was tired from his trip. The boy refused to eat much. Susan tried to give him water and held him close. Later, Jack took his bath and returned to the sitting room wearing simple clothes. He looked exhausted. "You should sleep," Susan told him. "I'll stay with him. Wake me if the fever gets worse." Susan nodded. Jack went into the bedroom and fell asleep quickly. Susan remained in the sitting room with the child lying against her chest. The house became very quiet. The television was on, but the volume was low. Susan barely watched it. She kept touching her son's forehead, checking whether the fever was reducing. The boy would sleep for a few minutes, move restlessly, and then open his eyes again. Susan rocked him slowly. "Sleep, my baby," she whispered. "Mommy is here." It was close to midnight when she heard the first knock at the compound gate. Susan lifted her head. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. The neighborhood was quiet, and almost everyone was asleep. She listened carefully. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then the knock came again. This time it was louder. Susan's body became tense. She looked toward the door. The child moved slightly in her arms. Another heavy knock followed. Susan's heart began to beat faster. Nobody they knew normally came to their house at that hour. She stood carefully, still carrying the child, and walked toward the bedroom. "Jack," she whispered. He did not move. She touched his shoulder. "Jack, wake up." Jack opened his eyes slowly. "What?" "Someone is knocking at the gate." He stared at her. "Who?" "How would I know?" Another loud sound came from outside. Jack sat up immediately. Susan noticed how quickly his sleep disappeared. She listened for a few seconds, then he got out of bed. "Stay here." "Where are you going?" "Just stay here." Jack opened a drawer and reached inside. Susan's stomach tightened when she saw him bring out the gun. "Jack, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know who is outside." "So you want to go there with a gun?" Jack checked the weapon quickly. Susan stared at him. He looked completely different from the tired man who had been sleeping a minute earlier. His movements were fast and controlled, almost as though he had prepared for something like this before. "Jack, call the police," Susan said. "Just stay behind me." "Who do you think is outside?" "Susan, please." Before she could ask another question, they heard a heavy sound near the compound wall. Then another. Jack's face changed. He moved toward the bedroom door and looked down the hallway. Susan followed a few steps behind him, holding the child tightly. "What is happening?" she whispered. Jack did not answer. Outside, several men had climbed over the fence and entered the compound. Susan heard footsteps and voices. Her fear increased instantly. "Jack, there are people inside. Go back." "Who are they?" "Go back now." Suddenly, there was a heavy hit against the front door. Susan jumped. The child woke fully and began to cry weakly. Another hit followed. Jack moved quickly through the hallway. Susan stood frozen for a moment. "Jack!" she called. The front door gave way with a loud crash. Susan screamed and stepped backwards. Men rushed inside. Everything happened so quickly that she could not understand what she was seeing. She only saw dark figures, weapons, and fast movement. "Jack!" someone shouted. Jack turned toward the side corridor. Instead of facing the men, he ran. That one action confused Susan more than anything else. If these were ordinary thieves, why were they calling his name? Why was Jack running away instead of protecting his family? "Stop!" one of the men shouted. Jack continued moving toward the corridor that led to the side of the building. Susan clutched the crying child and tried to move away. Then, gunfire exploded through the house. The sound was so loud that Susan screamed. She bent instinctively, trying to protect her son with her body. Another shot followed. She saw Jack stumble near the corridor. He fell against the wall and then dropped to the floor, grabbing his leg. "Jack!" Susan shouted. In the same moment, she felt her son Jack strangely in her arms. Susan looked down. At first, she did not understand what had happened. The child's crying stopped suddenly. Susan stared at his face. "Baby?" she whispered. There was blood. For one terrible second, Susan's mind refused to understand what her eyes were saying. "No," she said. "No, no, no." The men were still moving toward Jack. Susan heard shouting, but the words became unclear. Everything around her seemed distant. She looked down at her son again and saw more blood. Her whole body began shaking. "My baby!" she screamed. One of the armed men shouted for her to move away, but Susan did not know whether he was speaking to her or someone else. Panic took complete control of her. She did not know who the men were. She did not know whether they planned to kill everyone in the house. She saw Jack on the floor with blood around his leg and several men moving toward him. Jack tried to reach for something, but they overpowered him. Susan heard him groan in pain. She wanted to run to her husband, but then another part of her mind screamed at her to survive. Still holding the child, she ran toward the bathroom. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She entered, locked the door, and slid down against it, struggling to breathe. The child was in her arms, completely still. "Please," Susan whispered. "Please, please, please." Her hands were covered with blood. She touched his face. "Wake up. Mommy is here. Wake up." There was no response. Outside the bathroom, she could hear heavy footsteps, men shouting, and Jack crying out in pain. She heard movement through the hallway and the sound of the front door. Susan covered her mouth with one hand so she would not scream loudly. She was terrified the men would come for her next. Minutes felt like hours. She remained on the bathroom floor holding her child and listening. Slowly, the voices became distant. Then, there was silence. Susan stayed there for several more minutes because she was too afraid to open the door. Finally, she gathered enough courage to stand. Her knees were shaking badly. She unlocked the bathroom door slowly and looked outside. Nobody was there. "Jack?" she called weakly. There was no answer. "Jack!" She walked into the hallway. The front door was damaged. Furniture had been moved during the chaos. There were marks on the walls and blood near the corridor where Jack had fallen, but Jack was gone. Susan looked down at the child in her arms. "Somebody help me," she suddenly screamed. "Please, somebody help me." She ran toward the front of the house. Neighbors who had heard the gunshots were already beginning to come outside. Some had been too afraid to leave their homes while the shooting was happening, but once the compound became quiet, people started gathering. A neighbor rushed through the damaged entrance. "Susan," the woman shouted. "What happened?" Susan could barely speak. She held out the child. "My baby, please, my baby." The neighbor took one look and covered her mouth. Another man entered and quickly moved toward them. "We need to take the child to the hospital." Susan followed them, crying uncontrollably. Someone brought a car. They rushed the boy away, but deep inside, Susan already knew something was terribly wrong. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed what she had feared. Her son was dead. Susan screamed so loudly that people in the corridor turned to look. She fell to the floor and had to be lifted by two women. "No, no, he had fever, that is all. He only had fever. He was fine. My son was fine." Nobody knew what to say to her. One woman held her while Susan shook violently. She kept asking for Jack. "Where is my husband? They took my husband. Find him. Please, find him." Nobody knew where he had been taken. By early morning, the news had spread throughout the neighborhood. Susan had barely slept. She sat in one place staring ahead, her eyes swollen from crying. Friends and neighbors stayed close because they were afraid to leave her alone. Mama and Chidi were keen, but before they could arrive, Susan insisted that she had to report what had happened. She believed armed men had entered her home, killed her child, and kidnapped Jack. Two friends and one neighbor accompanied her to the police station. Susan looked terrible. Her clothes had been changed, but she still felt as though blood was on her hands. She walked into the station slowly, supported by one of her friends. "My husband was taken last night," she told an officer. "Armed men entered our house. They shot my son. They took my husband." The officer looked at her carefully and asked for Jack's full name. She gave it. The officer's expression changed slightly. He looked toward another officer, then back at Susan. "Your husband is Jack?" "Yes, please, you have to find him." The officer hesitated. "Madam, sit down." Susan became impatient. "I don't want to sit down. My husband was taken." "Please, sit down first." Something in his voice frightened her. Susan slowly lowered herself into a chair. A few minutes later, while she was waiting, she looked toward another section of the station and froze. Several men were sitting under guard. Susan recognized one of them immediately. He had been to their house many times. Another man beside him had also visited Jack. Susan stood up slowly. I know those men. Her friend looked where she was pointing. Who are they? They work with Chief. They are Jack's friends. Susan felt dizzy. She turned to the officer. Why are they here? The officer looked at her for a long moment. Madam, the people who came to your house last night were officers. Susan stared at him. What? They were part of an operation. No. Susan shook her head quickly. No, officers do not enter somebody's house like that and take the husband away. Your husband was wanted. Susan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Wanted for what? She finally asked. The officer pulled a chair closer. Madam, there has been an investigation for some time. Your husband and several other men working around the chief have been under investigation. Susan looked toward the arrested men again. Investigation for what? The officer's answer came slowly. Kidnapping, armed operations, contract killings, other serious crimes. Susan stared at him as though he had started speaking a language she could not understand. My husband? Yes. Jack? Yes, madam. Susan laughed once, but it was not because anything was funny. It was the sound of a person whose mind could not accept what she was hearing. No, Jack is a bouncer. He works security for Chief. The officer's face remained serious. That may be what he told you. Susan stood up. No, you have the wrong person. Madam, no, my husband is not a kidnapper. Her friend held her arm. Susan, calm down. Susan pulled away. They are lying. Jack works for Chief. He travels with Chief. He does security. The officer nodded slowly. Chief has also been arrested. Susan stopped moving. The room suddenly seemed to spin around her. What? The investigation involves him too. Susan sat down heavily. Her breathing became fast. The officer continued explaining that the group had allegedly been used for several illegal activities and that investigators believed powerful people had paid some members to handle violent jobs. Susan barely heard the rest. Her mind had already started moving backward through the years. Jack leaving the house at 2 a.m, Jack disappearing for weeks, Jack returning with large amounts of money, the strange men who visited the apartment, their secret conversations, the way they stopped talking whenever she entered, the gun hidden in the bedroom, Jack's phone being switched off for days, his quick reaction when the knocking started, the way he had immediately reached for the gun, the way he had tried to run when the armed men entered. Everything connected at once. Susan covered her mouth. Oh my God. Her friend sat beside her. Susan. Susan shook her head repeatedly. Tears started falling again. Chidi told me. What? My brother told me, her voice broke. Before I married him, Chidi told me. He said he knew Jack from university. He said Jack moved with dangerous people. He said rich men used people like them for dirty jobs. Susan pressed both hands against her head. I did not listen. The officer remained silent. There was nothing he could say that would make the truth easier. Susan began crying harder. My child is dead because of this. My baby is dead. She looked toward the arrested men and then back at the officer. Where is Jack? He is in custody. He was injured during the operation. Susan closed her eyes. For years she had defended Jack. She had told Mama that he had changed. She had told Chidi that he was judging a man by his past. She had convinced herself that the money, kindness, and love meant he could not be the kind of person Chidi described. Now she understood that the man she knew at home and the man who existed outside their marriage were two completely different people. Jack loved her, perhaps in his own way, but he also lied to her every day. The apartment, the gifts, the car, the trips, the midnight calls, and the men who frightened her were all connected to a life he had hidden behind the word security. Susan lowered her head and cried until her body hurt. Her friend stayed beside her, but she felt completely alone. She had lost her son only hours earlier, and now she was losing the entire truth of her marriage. The warning Chidi had given her years ago returned to her with painful clarity, And for the first time, Susan understood that the feeling she had tried so hard to silence had been warning her all along that something about Jack's life was terribly wrong. The days after Susan discovered the truth about Jack were the darkest days she had ever known. She felt as if everything in her life had ended at once. She had lost her little boy, the child she had carried inside her body, given birth to, cared for every day, and loved more than anything in the world. At the same time, she had discovered that the man she had trusted as her husband had been living a secret life for years. She hardly slept. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the night of the shooting again. She heard the loud knocks at the gate. She heard the front door breaking open. She heard the gunshots. She saw Jack trying to run through the corridor. Most painfully, she remembered the sudden movement of her son's small body in her arms and the blood that appeared before she even understood what had happened. Sometimes, Susan would wake from sleep shouting and searching around the room for her child. Mama would rush to her side and hold her tightly. "Susan, it is me," Mama would say softly. "You are safe. You are here with me." Susan would look around in confusion for a few seconds before remembering everything. Then she would begin to cry again. "Mama, my baby is gone," she would say. "My baby is really gone." Mama would sit beside her and cry quietly too, because the child had been her grandchild and she was grieving as well. "I know, my daughter," Mama would whisper. "I know." Nothing anybody said could remove Susan's pain. Some mornings she refused to get out of bed. She would lie there staring at the wall, not hungry, not interested in bathing, not interested in speaking to anyone. Her friends called constantly, but most of the time she refused to answer the phone. There were too many questions, too many people who wanted to know what had happened, and Susan did not have the strength to explain. News about Jack's arrest spread quickly through Ibadan. People who had known him began talking. Some claimed they had always suspected him. Others suddenly remembered seeing him with dangerous men. Some people told different versions of the story, including things that were not even true. Susan hated hearing any of it. She felt as though her private life had become something for strangers to discuss. Even worse, she knew that some people were looking at her and wondering how she could have lived with Jack for years without knowing what he was doing. One afternoon, while Susan was sitting quietly in Mama's house, one of her friends called. Susan almost ignored the call, but after the phone rang several times, she answered. "Hello." Her voice was weak. "Susan, how are you?" the friend asked carefully. "I don't know. I just wanted to check on you." Susan remained quiet. Her friend hesitated before continuing. "People are talking at work." Susan closed her eyes. "I knew it. Please don't worry about them." "What are they saying?" "Susan, forget it. Tell me." Her friend sighed. "Some people are asking questions. They are saying they never knew Jack was involved in those things. Some are wondering whether you knew." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I did not know. I know. I swear I did not know. Susan, I know that. The people who know you would never be part of something like that." Susan wiped her face. "But everyone is looking at me like I am a criminal too." "No, not everyone. I cannot come back there. Don't decide that now. Take care of yourself first." Susan ended the call and cried for almost an hour. The shame was becoming almost as heavy as the grief. She had always been proud of being a hard-working woman. She had her own job before Jack came into her life. She had never depended completely on anyone. But after Jack became successful in her eyes and started providing so much, people began seeing her as the wife of a comfortable man. She had enjoyed the apartment, the car, the money, and the good life, never knowing that some of it might have come from terrible things. Now she felt dirty whenever she remembered those gifts. A few days later, Susan was informed that investigators were going through Jack's finances and property. She was asked questions about the apartment, the car, and other things he had bought. She answered honestly. He rented the apartment before we got married, she explained. He told me the money came from his work with Chief. Did you ever ask how much he earned? Susan looked down. Not properly. Did you know about any other businesses he had? No. Did you ever see large amounts of cash? Susan hesitated. Sometimes. How much? I don't know. He carried cash sometimes. I asked him once or twice, but he said Chief paid him for work and travel. The officer wrote something down. Susan felt embarrassed. I know how it sounds. The officer looked at her. We are only asking questions, madam. I should have asked more. That is not something we are deciding here. Just tell us what you know. Susan nodded. She told them about the men who used to visit, the late-night calls, the trips, and the gun. As she spoke, she became more upset with herself. Things that seemed separate before now looked connected. The investigators later sealed the apartment while they continued looking into Jack's assets and the criminal network. The car Jack had bought Susan was also taken as part of the investigation. When Susan saw the official notice on the property, she stood outside the compound for a long time, staring at the place that had once made her so happy. That apartment had been one of the biggest reasons she trusted Jack. She remembered the first day he gave her the keys. She remembered walking through the rooms in surprise. She remembered the furniture arriving one after another. She remembered how proud she had been when Mama first visited. She remembered bringing her newborn son into that house from the hospital. She remembered the little boy learning to walk across the sitting room. She remembered Jack carrying him on his shoulders. Then she remembered the gunshots. Suddenly, the house no longer looked like a home. It looked like a place filled with memories she could not bear. One of the officers allowed her to collect a few personal things after the necessary checks were made. Susan entered the house with trembling legs. The damage from the raid had not completely disappeared. The broken part of the door had been covered, but she could still see where everything had happened. She walked into her son's room and stopped. His small clothes were still there. His toys were still in a basket near the wall. A small pair of shoes sat on the floor exactly where they had been left. Susan pressed both hands over her mouth. No, she whispered. She moved toward the bed and picked up one of his shirts. She held it against her chest and collapsed onto the mattress. My baby, she cried. Why did this happen to you? The woman who had accompanied her tried to comfort her, but Susan could not stop. She packed only a few things that belonged to her personally, including some of her son's clothes and photographs. She did not want anything expensive that Jack had bought. She did not want jewelry. She did not want designer bags. She did not want to remember the money. As she left the apartment, she turned back once and looked at the door. She knew she never wanted to live there again. After that, Susan decided to leave that part of Ibadan completely and return to Mama's home in the quieter community where she had lived before marriage. Mama welcomed her without asking questions. Chidi was there too, but his reaction was more difficult. He had been trying to stay strong since the death of his nephew, but anger had been building inside him. He was angry with Jack, he was angry with Chief, he was angry with the men who had been involved in the criminal network, and somewhere inside, he was also angry with Susan for refusing to listen years earlier. The first few days after Susan returned, Chidi barely spoke about it. He helped carry her bags into the house and made sure she had what she needed, but there was a distance between them. Susan noticed it. One evening, she found him sitting outside alone. She stood there for a moment before approaching him. Chidi? He looked up. Yes? Can I sit? It is not my chair. Susan sat beside him. For some time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Susan said, You are angry with me. Chidi looked away. What do you want me to say? The truth. He laughed without joy. You want the truth now? Susan's face fell. I deserve that. Chidi immediately regretted the sharpness of his words, but years of fear and pain were coming out at once. Susan, I warned you. I begged you. Mama warned you. I told you that man was dangerous. Susan looked down. I know. You defended him every time. I know. You said he had changed. I know. Chidi's voice became louder. You said I was judging him because of his past. You said I did not want you to be happy. Susan began to cry. I know, Chidi. He stopped for a moment. Seeing his sister cry softened him, but he was still hurting. Do you know how I felt when I heard about the shooting? Do you know what went through my mind when they told me your child was dead? I kept thinking about that day. I kept thinking that maybe if I had pushed harder, maybe if I had refused to allow the wedding, maybe... No, Susan interrupted through tears. Don't do that to yourself. Chidi looked at her. Then what should I do? I watched you walk into something I was afraid of. Susan wiped her face. You tried. I refused to listen. Her voice shook. I was in love. I saw how he treated me and I thought that was enough. I thought because he loved me, he could not be dangerous. I thought because he gave me everything, he must be a good man. I was wrong. Chidi became quiet. Susan continued. Every day since that night, I hear your warning in my head. I see Mama asking me to be careful. I remember everything. I know I made a terrible mistake, but Chidi, I have already lost my son. I have lost my husband too because the person I thought he was never really existed. I don't know how much more punishment I can carry. Chidi looked at his sister and saw how broken she was. Her face had become thinner. Her eyes looked tired. This was not the confident Susan who once argued with him. This was a woman struggling to survive the worst thing that had ever happened to her. He took a deep breath. I am angry, he said quietly, but I am not going to abandon you. Susan looked at him. You said before the wedding that if trouble came, you would not put your hand in it. Chidi nodded slowly. I said that because I was frustrated. You are my sister. What do you expect me to do now? Throw you outside? Susan began to cry harder. Chidi moved closer and put his arm around her. I wish you had listened, he said. I really do. But wishing will not bring that boy back. It will not change Jack. We have to deal with what is left. Susan rested her head against her brother's shoulder. I am sorry. I know. Mama had been standing near the doorway and had heard part of the conversation. She came outside and sat beside them. Enough blaming, she said. We have all suffered. Susan has learned in the hardest way possible. We cannot destroy her because she made a mistake. Chidi nodded. Mama held Susan's hand. You are still alive. That means your life is not over. Susan shook her head. Sometimes it feels over. It is not. Mama, I don't even know who I am anymore. Then you will learn again. Susan looked at her mother through tears. Mama continued. Before Jack, you were Susan. You worked, you had dreams, you helped this family. You laughed, you lived. Marriage did not create you. Jack did not create you. His crimes cannot be the end of your life. Those words stayed with Susan. She did not change overnight. Healing did not come simply because her family loved her. There were still terrible days. There were days she stayed in bed until afternoon. There were days she picked up one of her son's shirts and cried until her eyes became swollen. Sometimes she heard a child laughing outside and her heart broke all over again. At other times, she became angry with Jack. She would sit alone and think about all the times she had asked him questions. She remembered asking why he disappeared at night. She remembered asking why his friends whispered. She remembered asking about the gun. Each time, he had looked at her and lied. The anger became especially strong when she received information about the investigation. More evidence was discovered against Jack and the other men. The case was bigger than Susan had first understood. Investigators linked the group to kidnappings, violent attacks, and killings done for money. Some of the victims had been people the group had never even known personally. They had allegedly acted because they were paid. The wealthy chief was accused of being involved in the network and using his position and money to support illegal operations while hiding behind legitimate business. When Susan heard these details, she became physically sick. She rushed into the bathroom and vomited. Mama followed her. What happened? I cannot believe I slept beside that man, Susan said, breathing heavily. I cannot believe I raised my child with him. Mama rubbed her back. You did not know. But I should have known. You suspected something. That is different from knowing. Susan turned toward her mother. Maybe if I had left when I found the gun, my son would still be alive. Mama's eyes filled with tears. Do not keep killing yourself with that question. How can I not? Because you cannot go back and change it. Susan covered her face. I hate him, Mama. You are allowed to be angry. And the worst thing is that part of me remembers loving him. How can I love somebody who did all of that? Mama held her. Because you loved the person he showed you. You did not love the crimes you did not know about. That answer helped Susan slightly, although the confusion remained. Months passed as the investigation moved toward trial. Jack had been seriously injured in the leg during the arrest. Doctors were able to save his life, but the damage to the leg was severe and he never returned to walking normally. Susan heard through the case that he now moves with difficulty and sometimes needed support. Susan did not feel happy about his injury, but she also could not bring herself to feel sorry for him the way she once would have. The man who had been shot that night had carried secrets into their marriage for years. Eventually, Susan was told that Jack wanted to see her. At first, she refused. "I have nothing to say to him," she told Chidi. "Then don't go," Chidi replied. Susan thought about it for several days. Part of her wanted answers. Another part feared seeing Jack would reopen wounds that had started to close. In the end, she decided not to visit him. She told herself that whatever explanation he gave could not change what had happened. He had had years to tell her the truth. He had chosen not to. Susan instead focused on the court process from a distance and cooperated whenever authorities needed information from her. As the trial continued, evidence from witnesses, records, money movements, and other sources connected Jack and several others to serious offenses. The details were difficult for Susan to hear, so she stopped following every report. "Tell me only when something important happens," she asked Chidi. "I don't want to know every terrible thing." Chidi agreed. During this period, Susan also had to make a decision about work. She had stayed away for a long time. Her employer had allowed her time because of the tragedy and the investigation, but Susan knew she could not remain at home forever. The thought of returning terrified her. One morning, she dressed for work, stood in front of the mirror, and almost changed her mind. Mama entered the room and found her staring at herself. "You look fine," Mama said. Susan shook her head. "I feel like everybody will be looking at me." "Some people will look. That is not helping." Mama smiled slightly. "I am not going to lie to you. Some will look, some will whisper, some will ask foolish questions. But after some time, they will find another thing to talk about." Susan looked at her mother. "What if they think I knew?" "Do you know the truth?" "Yes." "Then stand in the truth." Susan took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can do this." Mama walked closer. "Go today. If you cannot stay the whole day, come back, but go." Susan finally left the house. Her hand shook while she drove in a borrowed car to work. The moment she entered the office, conversations became quieter. Some colleagues came to hug her. Others only greeted her carefully. One woman began crying and told Susan how sorry she was about her child. Susan thanked her. A few people asked questions that made her uncomfortable. "Did you really never know what your husband was doing?" one colleague asked later. Susan looked directly at her. "No, I did not know." The woman seemed embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I should not have asked." "It is okay." Susan went into the restroom afterward and cried for several minutes, but she did not go home. She washed her face, returned to her desk, and finished the day. That night when she came back, Mama smiled. "You went." Susan nodded. "And you came back alive." Susan laughed for the first time in days. "Mama, I am serious. Tomorrow will be easier." Mama was right. Slowly, work became normal again. People stopped staring as much. Susan began focusing on tasks. She started earning her salary again and saving money. For the first time since Jack's arrest, she felt that a part of her old life still existed. She no longer had the car Jack bought her or the expensive home he provided, but she had something she had almost forgotten was valuable: her own ability to take care of herself. She started contributing small amounts to Mama's household again. Chidi noticed and smiled one evening. "You are becoming troublesome again," he joked. Susan looked at him. "How?" "You are starting to argue about who will pay bills. That means you are getting better." Susan laughed. "Don't worry, I will soon become very troublesome." These small moments helped her heal. The grief never disappeared, but it became something she learned to carry. She kept photographs of her son in a special box and sometimes spoke about him with Mama instead of avoiding his name. On his birthday, Susan cried from morning until afternoon, but later she bought food and shared it with children in the area in his memory. He would have been 3 today, she told Mama quietly. Mama held her hand. He will always be your son. Susan nodded. I don't want to forget him. You won't. Eventually, the court case reached its end. Chidi came home one afternoon with a serious expression. Susan immediately knew there had been a decision. It is over, she asked. Chidi nodded. The judgment came today. Susan sat down slowly. What happened? Jack and several of the others were convicted. Susan looked at him. And Chief? He was convicted too on the charges the court found proved against him. Susan lowered her eyes. Prison? Yes. She remained silent for a long time. Chidi watched her carefully. Are you okay? I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to feel anything particular. Susan looked toward the window. I thought maybe when they finally sent him to prison, I would feel happy or relieved. Do you? A little relieved, but happy? No. She shook her head. Prison cannot bring my son back. No. And it cannot give me back the years I spent believing him. Chidi sat beside her. But at least you know the truth now. Susan nodded slowly. Yes, no more waiting for another secret to come out. That evening, Susan sat alone for a while and thought about Jack. She remembered the first phone he bought her. She remembered the apartment keys. She remembered his excitement when she told him she was pregnant. She remembered him carrying their baby around the sitting room. Those memories still existed, but now they sat beside darker truths. Susan understood that a person could be loving in one part of life and still be doing terrible things in another. Jack's affection for her did not make his crimes disappear. His generosity did not make him honest. His ability to be a caring father at home did not erase his danger he brought to their door. Susan also finally understood something Mama tried to tell her years earlier. Money could make life comfortable, but comfort was not the same as safety, and generosity was not proof of good character. As the months continued, Susan became stronger. She saved enough money to rent a small place of her own again, but this time she did it with her salary and savings. It was not as large as the 3-bedroom apartment Jack had once given her. It did not have expensive furniture. The sofa was simple, and some of the kitchen items were second-hand. But when Susan stood in the middle of the small sitting room with the keys in her hand, she felt something she had not felt in years. Peace. Mama and Chidi helped her move. Chidi carried a box inside and looked around. Small, but fine. Susan laughed. Who asked you? I am only saying, if you don't like it, carry the box back outside. Mama shook her head at both of them. You two have started again. They all laughed, and for a brief moment, Susan felt like the woman she had been before everything went wrong. She placed one framed photograph of her son in her bedroom. She did not hide him away. He was part of her life, even though his life had been painfully short. Susan continued working, continued visiting Mama and Chidi, and slowly built routines that belonged only to her. She did not rush into another relationship. In fact, for a long time, she wanted nothing to do with romance. She needed to learn how to trust herself again before she could think about trusting another person. She began paying more attention to the things she once dismissed. She understood now that unexplained wealth should bring questions, not excitement alone. A partner who disappears for days and refuses to explain should not be protected by excuses. Friends who create fear, secret conversations, weapons, and constant lies are not small warning signs simply because the person involved is kind at home. Susan did not spend every day blaming herself, but she allowed herself to learn from what happened. One evening, many months after Jack was sentenced, Susan visited Mama. The 3 of them sat outside as the evening became cooler. Chidi looked at his sister and said, You look different. Susan smiled. Different how? Calmer. Mama nodded. She is coming back to herself. Susan looked down at her hands. I don't think I can ever be the person I was before. Mama replied gently. Maybe you are not supposed to be. Susan looked at her. What do you mean? You went through something that changed you. You cannot become the old Susan completely, but you can become a wiser Susan. Susan thought about the words and smiled faintly. I like that better. Chidi leaned back. As long as this wiser Susan listens to her brother. Susan immediately frowned. "Don't start." Mama laughed. "Both of you should leave me in peace." Susan laughed too, and this time the laughter came freely. Later that night, as she drove back to her own small apartment, Susan thought about how far she had come. There had been a time when she believed losing Jack's money, his apartment, and the comfortable life he had provided meant losing everything. Now she understood that those things had never been the foundation of a good life. Peace mattered, truth mattered, safety mattered, family mattered. Being able to sleep at night without wondering where her husband had gone or who might come knocking at the gate mattered. She could not change the decision she had made. She could not return to the night of the shooting and save her child. She could not go back to the day Chidi warned her and choose differently, but she could decide what happened next. Susan chose not to spend the rest of her life trapped inside one terrible chapter. She carried her son in her heart, accepted the love and support of Mama and Chidi, worked hard, rebuilt her independence, and learned to trust her own questions instead of silencing them. Jack remained in prison with the others convicted for their crimes, and that part of Susan's life was finally closed. She no longer waited for his calls, wondered about his trips, or searched his face for answers. The man she had once defended so strongly had made his choices, and now Susan was making hers. She chose honesty over comfort, peace over appearance, and a simple life she could understand over a luxurious life built on secrets. Her pain did not disappear completely, and there were still nights when she missed her little boy so deeply that tears came without warning. But grief was no longer the only thing inside her. There was strength too. There was wisdom. There was hope. And after everything she had lost, Susan finally understood that starting again did not mean forgetting the past. It meant refusing to let the past decide the rest of her life. The lesson from Susan's story is that love and money should never make us ignore serious warning signs. A person may treat you well and still be living a dangerous or dishonest life. So it is important to ask questions, pay attention to strange behavior, and listen when people who truly care about you raise genuine concerns. Peace, honesty, and safety are worth more than gifts, money, or a comfortable lifestyle.